What if your child burned to death before your eyes, and you couldn't do a thing to stop it? Since the fire of '81, Walter Greaves, a former firefighter, exiled himself to a frozen lake cabin deep in Idaho's wilderness. For 11 years, he never lit another flame. Until one winter morning, he heard a sound beneath the ice. He found it barely breathing, a small, ash-gray creature with eyes that mirrored the gaze of his lost daughter. And from the moment he brought it home, the forest began to change. Stones arranged in strange symbols, whispers in the trees, and one moonlit night, a dozen towering silhouettes stood outside his cabin, watching in silence. This is no cryptid tale. This story was recovered from a burned journal buried beneath a maple tree by Glacier, the very place that fire once consumed everything. Stay with this video and you'll discover why a Bigfoot cub carries a human memory, how a broken man found redemption in the unlikeliest bond, and the final act of a father who gave fire one last time. Walter Greaves, aged 74, died alone. Yet on the frost-covered ground outside his cabin, 2 sets of footprints remained, one human and one not. This story will change the way you see the woods forever, and if you skip it, you'll never know why. In the dead of winter, that maple tree began to bloom. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, but the sky stayed shut like a locked door. Flat gray, no sun, no shape. Walter Greaves trudged through the pines, his boots sinking with each step, breath rising in slow, tired clouds. His traps were set 2 days ago, maybe more. Time slid quiet out here like everything else. Trees didn't keep clocks. The old man paused at a bend in the game trail. A soft creak in his knee reminded him he wasn't built for this anymore. Not really. But he went on. He always went on. He adjusted the canvas strap slung over his shoulder, the wire snare kit rattling faintly in the canvas bag. His coat, fireman's wool, thick and faded, hung off his shoulders like it still carried the weight of 20 years ago. He didn't mind the cold. What bothered him was silence, not the good kind. The kind that echoed, and then it cracked. A sound split the hush like a dry bone breaking in slow motion, sharp, brittle, drawn out. Not close. Somewhere out on the lake. He froze. Another sound followed. Higher, thin and strange. Not quite human, not quite animal either. Something in between. It pierced the air like a question nobody wanted to answer. He raised his binoculars, hands shaking slightly, not from cold, not entirely. Out past the tree line, the lake lay frozen in a smooth sheet, white, almost glass-like, and in the middle of it, no bigger than a speck, was something moving, or stuck. He squinted. No, not moving, struggling. It had limbs, but the proportions were off. Too long in the arms, covered in dark, wet fur. One leg jammed through the ice, twisted, like it had fallen in and couldn't climb out. Not a bear, not a wolf, and definitely not a man. Walter's chest tightened. He turned without thinking, half running, half stumbling toward the lake. His boots crunched through the fresh powder as he veered off the trail, cutting across low brush and wind-flattened grass. The sound again, a broken moan, rose up and faded. He didn't stop. The edge of the lake met him like a silent dare. He hesitated, scanned the ice. No cracking yet, but the creature was far, too far, maybe 80 yards out. He grabbed a long pine branch from the snowbank, tied one end of the rope to it, looped the other around his waist. The old rescue habits clicked into place like they'd never left him. He dropped to his knees, then to his belly, distributing his weight, and began to crawl. Every push forward sent the ice groaning under his belly. Don't think, don't listen, just go! The wind came in low from the west, hissing across the lake's surface, stinging his eyes. His breath turned to steam that clung to his beard. The creature wasn't crying out anymore. It was just watching him. It had stopped flailing, its head tilted. He inched closer, 30 yards. He could see its eyes now. deep-set, glassy. Its body trembled, wet fur matted against skin like scorched earth after a fire. 15 yards. A fresh crack whipped beneath him, long and jagged. He stopped breathing. The ice sagged under his chest. Then another shift, louder, closer. He planted the branch forward, slid his weight over it, and tossed the loose rope end toward the creature. It didn't take it. It didn't move. Just stared. He cursed under his breath and tried again. The third throw landed near its hand. The creature looked at it, then at him. And finally, slowly, it reached. Walter pulled, gently, steadily, murmuring things he hadn't said out loud in over a decade. Not prayers, not really, but close. The rope tightened. The creature groaned low in its chest as its trapped legs slid free with a splash. Another snap. The ice gave way under its side, but he pulled harder, dragging it inch by inch, feeling every fracture ripple under him like nerves on fire. One final heave. Then they were both flat on the ice, soaked, wheezing, silent. Walter turned to look at it, and it was looking at him. The wind dropped to nothing. The lake held its breath. For a long time, neither of them moved. Its eyes were too large, too dark. But in them, somewhere beneath the mud and cold and fear, he saw something else. Recognition. No, not recognition. Memory. It was the eyes that undid him. Because they weren't animal. They weren't wild. They were human. And worse, he had seen them before. 11 years ago. In a hallway of smoke. In a house on fire. When the beam collapsed and he couldn't reach her. His daughter. Her eyes just like that behind the flame. Staring, waiting. And he hadn't been fast enough. The lake faded around him. His knees buckled. The cold didn't matter anymore. He touched the creature's face, not to comfort it, but to make sure he wasn't dreaming. It blinked slowly, leaned in, not a threat, not a plea, and exhaled like it was letting go of something heavy. Walter let the rope fall. The silence returned. But it wasn't empty now. It was holding something, and that something had claws, and breath, and eyes that remembered things he wished he could forget. He knelt there, shaking, hand on its shoulder. And for the first time in years, Walter Greaves cried. But not from fear, not even from sorrow. He cried because in a world of frozen things, something had reached out and taken his hand. He didn't cry. That was the first thing Walter noticed. No whimpers, no shrieks, not even a wounded growl. Just the faint, uneven rasp of breath and the soft hiss of wet fur against wool as Walter bundled the creature, still soaked and shivering, into his old jacket. The same jacket Margaret used to wear when she sat on the porch with a coffee mug in her hands, and their daughter curled beside her under a knitted throw. He hadn't touched it in over a decade, and now it was wrapped around something he didn't even have a name for. The cabin welcomed them like a cold mouth, dark, stale, and hollow. Walter shouldered the door open with a grunt, a swirl of snow curling in behind him. The place smelled like old pine resin and stove ash, and the floor moaned under his weight as he crossed to the hearth. The logs from 3 nights ago still sat there, untouched, gray with soot. He hadn't lit a fire in 11 years. Not since the night he'd buried her. Not since he'd stopped pretending warmth was something he deserved. But he struck a match anyway. The flames caught slow, then climbed, amber and orange licking the silence until the shadows stepped back. Walter crouched beside the hearth and eased the creature down onto a folded wool blanket. Its breathing was shallow, but steady. He unwrapped the soaked coat and paused. The creature's arms, long, sinewed, more human than not, twitched slightly as they met the warmth. Its skin beneath the fur was mottled, bruised from cold, raw where the ice had bitten deepest. Walter didn't touch the wounds, just watched. It opened its eyes. Not startled, not wild, it just looked at him. There was something ancient in that gaze. Not age, exactly, but a stillness, as if this thing knew pain the way trees knew wind. Nothing to resist, only to endure. Walter stared back, trying to feel afraid. He couldn't. He was too tired for fear. too full of other things. He poured water into a dented saucepan and set it near the edge of the fire. From the pantry shelf, he pulled a can of evaporated milk, then paused again, fingers brushing against the metal rim. He almost smiled. Margaret used to keep those on hand for when Lily caught a cold. Warm milk and honey. He stirred slowly, added a pinch of sugar, then poured it into an old mug and set it near the creature's hand. It didn't touch it, but it watched him do it. He draped another blanket over its shoulders. Its breathing slowed. Later, after night had settled deep around the cabin and the wind began combing through the eaves again, Walter sat in the rocking chair and stared at the thing curled by the fire. Not asleep, just resting, listening. He saw the way it tracked the room, not like a wild animal, but like someone searching for something they once knew. Its eyes followed the flicker of light against the walls, then stopped on a dark corner near the back door. Walter didn't look. That was where the pictures used to hang. That was where Lily's drawing once was. Crayon sunflowers and fire trucks and red stick figures with too many fingers. He'd taken it down the night she died. Couldn't bear the sight of it. The fire crackled. The milk sat untouched. Outside, the wind dropped. Inside, the world held its breath. The creature shifted suddenly, rising on one elbow. Walter leaned forward, unsure if it was about to bolt. But it didn't. It looked past him, toward the back wall. Then it stood, slow and deliberate, limbs stiff. It padded across the floor on oddly human feet, then stopped at the far wall, beneath the rafters where the fire had licked hottest back then. There was a rusted nail still buried there. He'd never pulled it out. The creature reached up and traced the wall with one clawed finger. Right above that nail, right at the place where, years ago, a picture frame had melted in the heat, where smoke had turned white paint to black streaks. Walter remembered that sound too well. Glass breaking, the soft crack of wood warping. The nail had stayed. And now, this thing had found it. It pressed its hand flat to the wall. Didn't move. Didn't look at Walter. Just stayed like that. Walter didn't speak. Wouldn't have known what to say even if he could. Instead, he stood, quietly. His knees popped and complained. He shuffled to the cupboard, pulled out a towel, and set it by the fire. The creature came back to the hearth without a sound. Sat again, curled in tighter this time. Walter moved toward the back door and paused, his fingers brushing the frame. Then he reached up, almost without thinking, and pulled the old photo from the rafter ledge. Scorched and curled at the edges, the one thing he hadn't been able to throw away. He looked at it. Lily, 7 years old, brown hair, laughing, her arms wrapped around a stuffed fox with one missing ear. Margaret's hand resting on her shoulder. Taken a week before everything turned to smoke. He turned the photo toward the firelight. The creature's eyes widened. It leaned forward, slowly, reverently. One finger lifted, hovered, then touched the corner of the photo, soft as breath. Its lip trembled, and for just a second, Walter thought he saw it. Tears, real ones, in the corners of those impossibly deep eyes. It blinked them away, but the silence changed shape. Walter said nothing. The fire hissed low. The wind moved again, brushing the windows like fingers searching for a way in. And somewhere in the dark outside, beyond the trees and the frozen lake, something else was listening, watching. The cabin held steady, but Walter's heart didn't, because something had shifted. Not in the creature, not in the storm, in him. He didn't understand it. He didn't need to. But that night, when the creature lay curled by the fire and the photo sat untouched on the table, Walter Greaves did something he hadn't done in 11 long winters. He hummed, low, quiet, a tune with no words, a tune Margaret used to play. And somewhere in the silence between notes, something hummed back. He named him Ash. It slipped out one morning like breath fogging against the glass. Walter was washing a pan in the half-light, fingers numb from the icy basin water, when he glanced back and saw the creature curled beside the hearth again, head resting on a rolled blanket, one leg stretched out like a child used to doing this. And without thinking, the name left his mouth. Ash, like what was left when fire takes everything. The creature looked up, not startled, not confused, just listening. Then it blinked once, slow and full, and lowered its head again. Ash. It fit, more than Walter wanted it to. The days bled into each other, slow and hushed. The snow climbed the cabin walls like it was trying to bury time itself, and the lake out front froze thicker with each passing night. Ash got stronger. He stopped shivering by the second week, started mimicking the way Walter moved, awkward at first, but then more deliberate. His hands, large and padded, learned to grip the axe handle. His arms swung down on the log pile like he'd watched it done 1,000 times in dreams. Walter didn't correct him, just stood at the edge of the wood line and watched. Sometimes, Ash would follow him deep into the trees, never more than 20 paces behind, always quiet, always alert. He had a way of moving through branches like he belonged there, like the forest leaned to let him pass. Once, Walter found him crouched by the creek with a stick, tracing lines into the snow. When he stepped closer, he realized Ash had drawn the curve of the lake. The shapes were rough but unmistakable. The tall pines, the cabin, even the game trail winding back toward the old ranger post Walter never talked about. He stared at the marks, heart skipping. Ash wiped them away when he saw Walter looking. Another day, Walter found him in the tool shed. Ash had lined up every knife, every rusty saw, every bent nail and hook, sorted by shape, not size. The old man said nothing, just nodded once and walked back inside. At night, when the wind sounded like footsteps pacing along the eaves, Walter sometimes talked to him. Ash didn't speak, never made a sound except breath and the faint click of his claws on the wood. But he listened, like nobody had ever listened to Walter before. Walter told him about the fire. He told it in pieces, never the full truth all at once. How there'd been a lightning strike. Dry summer. How Margaret had yelled for him. How Lily was in the bedroom at the end of the hall. How the beam came down. How he ran with a broken ankle and a scream locked in his throat. How they never made it out. Ash never turned away. He just stayed there, shoulders hunched, eyes catching the firelight like glass in water, hands folded over each other like someone praying without knowing what for. That night, Walter pulled out the old harmonica, the one that hadn't been touched since the funeral. He sat on the edge of the bed, air thin in his lungs, and let the first notes roll out low and uneven. A mountain lullaby. One Margaret used to hum when Lily wouldn't sleep. Ash tilted his head. Then he reached for the wooden beam beside the hearth and tapped it. Once, twice, then matched the rhythm, then changed it just a little, adding something that wasn't there before, not just repeating, but answering. Walter stared. He didn't play another note that night. 2 days later, Ash found the photo. Walter had been chopping kindling behind the cabin, the scent of spruce sharp in the air. When he came back inside, the fire had dimmed, and the room was heavy with the hush of something just missed. Ash sat by the old bookshelf, the scorched floorboard creaking beneath him. In his hands was the small frame Walter thought he'd lost in the move after the fire. The photo was half burned, curled at the corners, faded nearly blank except for the central image. Lily, no older than 6, holding the stuffed fox she never slept without. Margaret's hand was on her shoulder, her wedding ring catching a flare of sunlight frozen in time. Walter stopped breathing. Ash was staring at the girl's face. One finger reached out and touched the spot where her eye had been. Then he turned the photo slightly, tilted it, brought it closer to his chest. His throat moved like he meant to say something, but no sound came. Walter knelt, slowly, knees groaning. He reached for the photo but stopped short. Ash looked at him, then held it out. Their fingers brushed. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not quite, but the memory of it. Later that night, Ash sat curled in the armchair by the fire, the very one Lily used to claim during storms. Walter brought him a folded quilt, the blue one with stitched patches shaped like clouds. He draped it over Ash's shoulders without a word. Ash pulled it tighter and did something Walter hadn't seen since the day they met. He smiled. It was small, quiet, not a baring of teeth, not animal. Just the lift at the corners of a mouth that knew what it meant to be warm and safe. Maybe only for a moment, but enough. And Walter, sitting on the floor by the fire with his back to the old wall where the nail still stuck out, closed his eyes and whispered the name again. Ash. The wind outside shifted. The chimney moaned. Somewhere out there, deep beyond the trees, something answered back, but neither of them moved. The fire kept burning, and for the first time in years, Walter didn't dream about screams. He dreamed about a boy, not quite human, not quite beast, standing at the edge of a lake that never cracked, watching the sun rise through smoke that never burned. He woke with tears dried into the corner of his beard, and a silence so whole, he almost didn't miss the sound of Margaret's voice. Almost. The first one showed up on a Tuesday. Walter didn't see it. Not at first. Just the sound. Pine needles shifting where they shouldn't. The faint rattle of snow falling from a branch with no wind. He stepped out to split wood and found it there on the stump. A perfect spiral made of stones no bigger than a walnut, set so precisely it looked almost etched. 13 in total. White against the dark bark, glinting in the weak morning light like teeth laid out in offering. He glanced toward the tree line. Nothing. He didn't touch the spiral. He just stared for a long time. That evening, he found the roots. 3 of them, braided together like a cord, left on the cabin's threshold. Still damp, smelling of moss and blood. Ash didn't look surprised when Walter showed him. Just took the bundle in his hands, lifted it to his face, and inhaled like it meant something. Then he set it by the hearth and didn't explain. The days began to bend. Footprints started to appear around the perimeter of the cabin. Not boot prints, not deer. Wider than any bear Walter had tracked. Longer than a man's stride, and they never came alone. Dozens. Crossing paths, moving in slow circles. Always stopping at the same spot, 10 yards from the porch, where the light of the fire wouldn't quite reach. Some mornings the snow was disturbed in patterns, long arcs, jagged lines like claw marks in frost. But there was no sound, no sign of approach, just the residue of presence. Ash began acting different. He would stand for long stretches at the window, eyes fixed on the tree line, body rigid like he was waiting for something to speak. Sometimes he'd hum, low, rhythmic tones that weren't quite a tune. More like a call. It unnerved Walter. Not because it was strange, but because the trees hummed back, faint, barely audible, as if the forest itself breathed in response. Then came the night the cabin disappeared. Not in a literal way. It was still there. Walls, roof, fire, the chair where Walter sat sharpening the blade of his old axe. But something had closed in. Pressure. The sense of being watched multiplied, until it wrapped around the room like smoke. Walter didn't notice it at first, not until the fire flickered too sharp. Shadows lengthened without reason, and the dogs, the ones that had gone quiet a decade ago, howled in his memory like they'd just caught a scent. Ash stood at the door, hand pressed against the wood, not moving, listening, and outside there were shapes. Dozens of them. Walter opened the door, and the world changed. The clearing that had always felt like home now looked foreign, like someone had rearranged the air. The trees were too still, the silence too loud. Snow fell in perfect lines, straight down, and just beyond the edge of the clearing stood the figures. Tall, massive, covered in fur that shimmered like wet stone in the firelight. Not just one, not two, an entire gathering, standing between the trees like guardians. Eyes catching light like amber caught in smoke. None moved, none advanced. They just watched. Breathing in unison. Ash stepped forward. He didn't look back at Walter. He whistled. It wasn't a sound Walter had ever heard come from a human mouth. It wasn't pitch or melody. It was a shape, a memory turned into breath, high, narrow, vibrating against the bones. And the forest answered. A cascade of tone fell back from the hills, from the trees, from somewhere beyond. The figures remained still, but something passed between them. Not in words, in understanding. The kind no language holds. Walter's hands trembled at his sides. This wasn't chance. This wasn't nature. This was ritual. The air felt thick, like the earth itself was holding breath. Ash walked further. The firelight painted his outline gold as he stood before them. They parted, not with fear, not even respect, but something else, like recognition. And then one of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, broader, its eyes darker. It held something in one massive hand, a strip of cloth, frayed at the edge, weathered by time. Walter's throat closed. He knew that cloth. It was the scarf, the old red one he'd wrapped Ash in the night he dragged him from the ice. It had gone missing weeks ago. He thought maybe it had burned in the hearth or blown off the porch. But here it was, held by something that had watched them longer than he realized. The creature held it up toward the sky, and for a moment, nothing moved. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. One by one, the others followed. No sound, no crunch of snow, just disappearance. Ash stood alone for a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the cabin without a word. Walter shut the door. The wind picked up outside, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt like breath exhaled after a long pause. Ash sat back in the chair. He didn't look at Walter, just reached for the photo again, the one with Lily. His fingers traced the edge. Walter sat across from him, his hands clenched. For the first time since the fire, he felt it. Judgment, not from Ash, from whatever stood in those trees. Not punishment, recognition. They had seen his grief, measured it, and for now they had left him standing. But something had changed. He felt it in the bones of the cabin, in the way the floor seemed warmer, the walls less tight. He'd been part of something, a witness, maybe even a guest. And from now on, he knew he was never alone out here. Not really. The forest was watching, and it remembered everything. The fire lit itself, or at least that's how it felt. Walter had been outside, checking the trap line for signs of movement, anything to remind him that the forest still breathed under all that snow. The morning had been so still he could hear the pop of ice from halfway across the lake. When he came back, there it was. Flames flickering in the hearth, logs arranged neatly like a miniature lodge, pine needles tucked beneath as kindling. Ash stood nearby, not proud, not grinning, just calm. A trace of soot marked the edge of his palm, like it had been there all along. Walter didn't speak. He hung his coat on the nail and stared at the flame. Something about it tugged at his chest. Not with pain, not anymore. It was something quieter, something like return. Later that afternoon, he found Ash crouched by the stove, boiling a small pile of brown mushrooms in a cracked enamel pot. Ash didn't look up when Walter stepped inside. He was stirring with the spine of a butter knife, watching the steam rise like he was reading smoke. Walter had seen those mushrooms before. Grew near the southern ridge, only after lightning storms. Toxic to raccoons. But the kid had boiled them twice, drained the water, then boiled them again with a pinch of crushed pine needles. Same method Walter's grandfather used to talk about. Long before books were the thing people trusted more than memory, Ash didn't eat like an animal. He portioned with care, always made sure there was enough for both of them. He'd chew slow, stare at the flame while he did, as if counting something in his head. Sometimes he'd wait until Walter took a bite before he moved, like he needed permission to belong. And now somehow he did. Walter had a metal whistle on a leather cord, old Forest Service issue. It hadn't left the nail since '83. One morning, after coffee and silence, he took it down, rubbed the dust off with the hem of his sleeve, and handed it to Ash. The boy held it in his palm for a moment, then lifted it to his lips. The sound was thin, steady, high enough to stir the birds in the tree line. Ash paused, adjusted the angle, blew again. This time the tone changed. Warmer, deeper. Like the whistle was remembering something too. He kept practicing, every evening, until one night. Walter sat out back with a can of beans and heard the whistle cut through the trees like it belonged there. Then silence. And then, distant but real. A note came back. Not from a bird, not from wind. Something larger, something old. Ash lowered the whistle and didn't speak. He didn't need to. Walter began sleeping with the door unlatched. The nights didn't feel so long anymore. The quiet was still thick, but now it had texture. Layers of meaning he could almost decipher. The fire kept burning later than it used to. Sometimes he'd wake to find it restoked, with fresh logs stacked by the hearth. Ash moved through the dark like a thought half remembered. Walter watched him sometimes from the porch, just a silhouette in the orange glow, stoking flame with careful hands, humming a rhythm that didn't come from any song Walter knew. But it settled deep in his bones anyway, like something you didn't have to understand to believe. The dreams came back too, not the ones that tore him from sleep, gasping and empty. No more firestorms or screams stuck behind locked doors. These were different, softer. A cabin filled with laughter he couldn't quite hear. A child's fingers against glass. Margaret's shawl swaying on the porch rail, catching dust motes like they were fireflies. And somewhere, always just beyond sight, was Ash. Older, maybe, but still quiet, still watching. That morning, when Walter woke, the sun was climbing. The frost had melted on the inside of the windows. He stepped out into a yard of silence and stopped. In the snow, laid out in a perfect spiral just a few feet from the door, were white pebbles, smooth and flat, arranged exactly like the first offering on the stump, except this time, in the very center, was something else. A single stitch, red thread, frayed at both ends, curled into the shape of a flame. Walter knew it, knew the pattern. It was from Lily's sweater, the last one Margaret ever knit, the one she wore the day they went into town and never came back whole. He bent down, hands shaking. When he touched the thread, the air shifted. Not wind, presence. He stood slowly, turned toward the trees. There, deep in the shadows near the ridge, something stood watching. Not moving, not hiding, just present. It didn't come closer. It didn't need to. Ash stepped up beside him. Didn't speak, didn't even look. Just stood shoulder to shoulder, gaze fixed on the same place. Walter looked down at the thread in his hand, then up again. The figure was gone, but he didn't feel alone. Inside, the fire hadn't gone out. Walter stepped into the cabin and shut the door behind him, not to keep something out, but to let something in. The warmth, the memory, the thing he'd spent 11 years pretending he didn't need. He sat by the fire. Ash sat across from him. Neither spoke. The flames popped and hissed. Ash took the whistle and blew one low, long note. The sound drifted through the logs, out into the trees, into the dark spaces between breath. And somewhere out there the woods answered, not loudly, not in words, just enough to say, "We see you, we remember, we are not done." The storm came without warning, not with thunder or blizzards, just a steady, relentless rain that turned the snow to slush and made the whole forest feel heavy, the kind of wet that soaked through bone. Walter hadn't seen rain like that in months, maybe years. It made the cabin feel smaller, closer. Ash had been different all day, not restless, not afraid, just distant. Like his thoughts had drifted somewhere far and old. He didn't eat much, didn't sit by the fire. He kept glancing at the window, at the dark line of trees smeared by mist. His eyes stayed wide but far away, and he moved like his body was being called somewhere his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Then, sometime near midnight, he was gone. No creak of the door, no shift in the wind, just silence. Walter woke to the cold. The fire had died to embers. The blanket where Ash slept lay flat, the quilt still warm but empty. Rain tapped against the glass, slow and steady, and the forest beyond looked like it had never been touched by sunlight. He didn't panic. Not yet. He put on his coat, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped into the night. The air hit him first, wet and clean, but full of something thick, something watching. The kind of air you feel before a funeral. The beam of his flashlight caught drops hanging from the branches like old tears. He followed the trail, footprints half sunk in the softened snow, oddly shaped but sure in their direction. He passed the firewood pile, the shed, the ridge where the trees thinned and the wind always curled. Then, just past the narrow gully that once held runoff from the spring melt, he saw the blackened stump. He knew this place. Even now, 11 years on, the char still clung to the roots. It was where the house had stood before the cabin, the house they lost, the place where Margaret screamed and he couldn't reach her, the place where Lily died. He didn't breathe. Not at first. Ash was kneeling there, in the clearing where fire had swallowed everything. His head bowed, arms loose at his sides. Rain slicked his fur, made him glisten like obsidian. And beside him, just barely lit by the weak flashlight glow, was something else, larger, still, watching. She knelt too. Not towering, not imposing, but present in a way that made the whole forest feel like it belonged to her. Her eyes were not human, but they were not beast either. They were old, and they were grieving. Walter didn't move, couldn't. He could feel the moment stretch between them, like time had loosened its grip on the earth. Ash looked up. His eyes found Walter's, and without a sound, he leaned into the creature's chest, into her arms. She held him, not tight, not like a claim, but like someone who had waited too long to finally breathe. Walter took a step forward. The creature's head turned, eyes locking with his. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, but raised one hand, slow, deliberate, and pressed it gently to her own chest. Then she moved forward, closed the space between them, and placed that hand over Walter's heart. He stopped, not out of fear, but because of what came next. She drew her hand back, and in her palm lay a necklace. Burnt silver, blackened at the edges, twisted but still whole. The locket. Margaret's. The one he thought lost in the fire, buried beneath the beam that crushed her ribs. The one she wore the day she died. The one she swore would be passed down to Lily. His knees buckled. He caught himself with one hand in the wet moss. The locket dangled from her fingers. Rain tapped against its metal skin. She knelt, held it out to him, and he took it. The chain was cold, but the warmth came after, a wave that spread through his chest, thick with memory. He could smell the cinnamon in Margaret's hair, hear Lily's laugh echo in the upstairs hallway, feel the weight of the door that wouldn't open, the smoke, the scream that never got past his throat. And now, this moment, this impossible, wordless truth that what was lost might not be gone. He closed his fingers around the locket. When he looked up, she was already holding Ash again. They turned, stepped back into the forest, melted into shadow. No goodbyes, no promises, just return. Walter stood there long after they disappeared. The rain began to slow. The mist pulled back, just a little. The clearing remained quiet, but something had shifted. Not in the trees, not in the soil, in him. He walked back with the locket in his palm, fingers trembling. The cabin welcomed him like a breath finally exhaled. He lit the fire again, sat on the floor beside it. The chain dangled from his hand. He didn't cry, not out loud, but his chest cracked in a way that let light in. For the first time in 11 years, he wasn't carrying the weight alone. He was being carried, and outside, at the edge of the forest, someone, something, was waiting still. The earth was soft that morning. Too soft for late winter. The ice along the lake's edge had pulled back like it was making space for something new. Walter stood under the porch awning with the locket still in his hand, and the memory of the night still heavy on his chest. He hadn't slept. Not really. His boots were already laced, his back sore from sitting too long, and the trail he was about to walk had been waiting years for him to return. Ash hadn't come back. Walter knew he wouldn't. Not in the way he had been. And that was the part that broke him more than he expected. So he packed what he could. A folded quilt, dried meat, a bundle of winterberries wrapped in wax paper, the photo, the one with Lily, still burnt at the edges, still somehow whole. He wrapped it in oilcloth and placed it inside a tin box lined with pine shavings, like he was burying a relic. Then he stepped off the porch and started walking. The path curved west through low trees and snow-bent brush. Walter moved slow, not because he was old, but because this felt like ritual, like every step had to count. He passed the half-frozen creek where Ash once watched the trout shimmer under the ice. Past the stump where the first spiral had been left. Past the tree where Margaret carved his initials long before she ever said yes. And then there it was, the clearing. He hadn't come back here since the fire. The ground still bore the blackened roots. The soil smelled like wet ash and frozen loam. But in the center now stood something new. A small frame of timber. A lean-to, half-finished, shaped by large hands and thoughtful care. Fresh wood. Bark peeled. A roof of woven pine boughs and bark shingles. He set the bundle down at the foot of the structure, not near it. At it, like an offering. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Then, beside the bundle, he placed something else. The harmonica. The old one. Rust at the corners, the brass reed still intact. Ash had never played it. Only listened. But Walter left it anyway. He stepped back and took a deep breath. His lungs ached from the cold. That's when he saw it. Tucked beneath the edge of the lean-to, nestled in a coil of dried grass, was something glinting. Not metal. Bone. Carved. Polished smooth and set with a single dark stone shaped like a flame. He picked it up and turned it over. A pin. Delicate. Heavy with meaning. He knew it. Not from a store. Not from any catalog. It was Margaret's. Her hairpin. The one she only wore on Sundays. The one she'd taken off the night Lily was born and never used again. He didn't cry this time. He just smiled. Soft. Exhausted. But whole in a way he hadn't felt in over a decade. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small leather notebook. The one with all his fire maps, shift logs, weather reports no one read anymore. He opened to the first page and tore it out. The handwriting had faded, but the words still held. It was the note he'd written for Lily's 6th birthday. Just 3 words. You are enough. He folded it, set it beside the hairpin. Then he dug, just a little, under the sugar maple sapling that had begun to sprout in the middle of the ash pit. No tree had ever grown here. Not in 11 years. The roots were pale and new and reaching for something. He placed the tin box in the hole, covered it with earth, pressed it flat with his palm, and he whispered one thing. I'm sorry. The wind stirred. A crow called once from the ridge. The sun blinked through cloud. He stood, stepped back, and left the rest behind. The walk home was slow. The snow had melted in patches, and the air had that strange metallic smell it always did when spring tried to claw its way through winter's chest. When he reached the cabin, he noticed it right away. Something was hanging on the door. A necklace. Silver. Simple. The charm was shaped like fire. Not wild, not consuming. Controlled. Like a lantern flame. He took it down and held it in his palm. The metal was warm. He stepped inside and placed it on the mantel, beside the wooden owl carving Margaret once won at the county fair. The cabin felt different now. Not lighter, just more awake. That evening he cooked for 2. Habit, mostly. He made tea. Set one cup beside the other. And though no one sat across from him, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. He kept the door unlatched that night. The fire burned down to quiet embers. And in the dark, something rustled near the porch steps. He didn't move, didn't look, just listened and smiled. The lake never froze the same after that winter. Something about the way the water caught the morning light. Thinner, more transparent, like it didn't want to hide anything anymore. Walter noticed it right away. The old creaks beneath the surface didn't come back. The moans of shifting pressure, the long silences before the crack. Gone. The ice was smooth now, clear and silent in a different way. He kept living, quietly, deliberately. Ash didn't return. Not with footprints, not with sound. But Walter still left food near the edge of the clearing. Smoked trout, hand-split firewood wrapped in dry birch bark, bundles of roots he once watched Ash examine with the focus of a surgeon. He never saw who took them, but they were always gone by morning. And something new always arrived in their place. A polished stone with concentric rings carved by hand, a hollow antler filled with crushed mint and forest resin. Once, a bird's nest with 3 perfect pine cones woven into the rim like eggs waiting to be named. Walter never spoke of these things. He didn't write them down, didn't need to. They weren't for remembering the way people remember. They were meant to be carried. Like fire passed between hands in the dark. He carved more often now, whittled when the days were too warm to stay still. His fingers, knotted from cold and time, found their rhythm again. The last thing he made was a plaque, wide as his shoulders, smoothed with beeswax and inscribed with 5 words burned deep into the grain. Here I returned the fire. He placed it in the ground near the lake, just beyond where the ice had once broken beneath his weight. He didn't mark it with flowers or stones. He just left it there, under open sky, for whomever or whatever might understand. Weeks passed, then months. Walter grew slower, a stiffness in his spine that lingered past the mornings, a breath that caught on cold air longer than it should have. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Some days he walked the edge of the forest and swore he could feel Ash's shadow moving just behind the tree line. Never closer than the pines, never farther than memory. And then, one early spring morning, the cabin stood still. Neighbors said they hadn't seen smoke in a few days. That wasn't unusual. Walter liked solitude, liked disappearing. But when they came to check, the cabin was empty. Not abandoned, just silent. The hearth was warm. A cup of tea still sat on the table. The bed was made, tight at the corners like he used to do in the firehouse. And near the front door, carved into the threshold where snow sometimes drifted too far, were 2 prints, one human, one not, side by side, facing east, toward the place where the sun comes back. No one moved the plaque. No one touched the cup. The sheriff, a younger man who'd once heard stories about a boy lost in a storm, stood there a long time and didn't say a word. The prints faded by the next rain, but the cabin stayed, and so did the quiet. Sometimes, hikers came through that part of Tranquil Ridge and said strange things. That the woods felt warmer near the lake. That birds landed on their shoulders without fear. That they dreamed of songs they didn't recognize but woke up humming anyway. Once, a boy claimed he saw something between the trees. Something tall and kind, with dark eyes and an open hand. His mother told him not to make up stories. But the boy kept drawing spirals in the dirt for weeks. No one ever replaced the man at the cabin. No one needed to. He'd already passed on what mattered. Not in books, not in words. In something older. Something beyond language. Some days, if you stand quiet enough by the edge of the lake, you can feel it. The stillness that isn't empty. The air that listens. The warmth that doesn't come from firewood or sun. It comes from return. And if you watch long enough, you might see something watching back. Not to frighten you, but to remind you that nothing given in love is ever truly lost. And that silence, when shared, is sometimes the loudest thing in the world. Some stories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be whispered, across time, across silence, across the frozen skin of a lake where things once cracked open but somehow didn't break. Because some truths don't arrive with lightning or thunder. They come quietly, wrapped in the hush of snow, in the warmth of a hand once thought gone, in the way grief carves out a space only love can fill. This was never a tale about monsters or wilderness. It was always about what we carry and what we let go. About how sometimes the fire that nearly destroys us is the same one that lights our way back. It's about the weight of memory and the kind of forgiveness that doesn't come in words, but in gestures, in returning what was lost, in standing still when it would have been easier to run, in answering pain with presence. The world is full of things we'll never fully understand. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the things that can't be explained are the ones that matter most. Not because they defy reason, but because they ask us to feel instead of solve, to believe without proof, to heal without closure, to sit beside something wild and unspoken and choose not to fear it. In the end, it doesn't matter what name we give the mystery. What matters is how we show up for it, how we choose to stay when staying hurts, how we reach across the distance between what we know and what we've lost, and say, I'm still here. That's how healing begins. In silence, in return, in the small, stubborn act of lighting a fire and leaving the door open. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, even in the quietest way, we'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments. Every word you share adds warmth to this fire we're all gathered around. Don't forget to follow, subscribe, and keep walking with us into the deep woods, where the most human parts of us often meet the unknown.